Brazil are the only national team to have featured in every single edition of the FIFA World Cup, with even giants of the international game like the Netherlands and Portugal having qualified for fewer than half of the 21 World Cups that there have been in total. I was asked to make a video taking a look at the strongest national teams to have failed to qualify for each one of those finals, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. Just so we're clear, these are the best national teams at the time who failed to qualify, not the biggest nation that was missing at each finals or anything like that. 1930. Not applicable. Off to a flying start, I know, but there was no qualification process for the inaugural FIFA World Cup back in 1930, so there were no teams who failed to qualify. The only World Cup without a qualification process, back in 1930, teams were simply invited to compete by FIFA. Whilst the World Cup is now the most prestigious football tournament and arguably sporting event on the planet, back in 1930, it was brand new and a little unknown. Hosted by Uruguay, at a time when cross-continental travel was no easy feat, it was a struggle convincing teams from outside of South America to compete, rather than it being a struggle for nations to qualify, as is the case now. There were almost no nations from outside of the Americas at the finals before Jules Rimet stepped in and managed to pull some strings and convince 4 European nations to make the journey. 1934. Yugoslavia. That's more like it, an actual national team, albeit one that no longer exists. Of the 4 European nations who travelled to the 1930 World Cup, Yugoslavia performed best, coming in 4th place, although they were battered by Uruguay in the semi-finals. The 1934 World Cup was held in Europe, and suddenly European nations were much more keen. European qualifying took place via groups of only 2 or 3 teams, and Yugoslavia were in a tough group up against Romania and Switzerland. Despite being considered one of Europe's best teams, and boasting one of Europe's best players in the form of Blagoj Marjanovic, Yugoslavia fell short. They thrashed the likes of Brazil and Romania in friendly games that year, but fell short in those qualifiers, missing out on the finals in Italy. 1938. Yugoslavia. It was still a very rudimentary qualification process for the 1938 World Cup, which was the final World Cup before the start of World War II. Yugoslavia were drawn in a 2-team group up against Poland, a team who they had beaten 9-3 the last time the 2 teams met. On an October afternoon in Warsaw though, on the same day that Sir Oswald Mosley was knocked unconscious by a stone at a fascist rally in Liverpool, Yugoslavia would also be dealt a pretty serious blow. Poland won 4-0, and although Yugoslavia won in Belgrade, they couldn't overturn the margin of defeat in the first leg. Yugoslavia missed out on their 2nd consecutive World Cup, but had they not, we wouldn't have had one of the all-time great World Cup games. In their first World Cup match, and their only World Cup match in 1938, Poland were beaten 6-5 by Brazil after extra time in one of the most glorious tournament exits ever witnessed. 1950. Wales. A lot had changed in the world between 1938 and 1950, and football was no exception. The British, who had so long been the aristocrats of the game, were finally willing to dip their toes into some World Cup action. FIFA graciously didn't force the British and Irish to go through the needless European qualification process, and instead said the top 2 teams from that year's British Home Championships could compete to the 1950 World Cup in Brazil. England won the group, but were humiliated in South America. Scotland came 2nd, but couldn't compete, as they had boldly stated that they would only consider 1st place sufficient for them to justify qualifying. Ireland and Wales weren't offered Scotland's place, and I think a good case could be made for Wales being the strongest team not at the 1950 World Cup. John Charles made his Wales debut in 1950, and the nation went unbeaten in 1951, beating the likes of Switzerland, Portugal, and a rest of UK combined 11, as well as drawing with England. 1954. Sweden. It's a very easy decision in 1954, given that Sweden missed out to Belgium in qualifying. Sweden finished 4th at the 1938 World Cup, 3rd at the 1950 World Cup, and they would go on to reach the final just 4 years later in 1958. Clearly this was an immensely talented squad, although they were without some of their star men and their manager George Reyna in 1954. Belgium, who qualified ahead of them, didn't win a single game at the 1954 World Cup, meanwhile Reyna and Sweden's big hitters returned for a memorable run in 1958. 1958. Uruguay. The toughest decision in this video so far, and by some distance, the 2 most successful teams in international football back in the 1950s both failed to qualify for the 1958 World Cup. Uruguay and Italy had won 4 of the first 5 editions of the World Cup between them, but neither nation qualified in 1958. Italy failed to finish ahead of Northern Ireland in their qualifying group, whilst Uruguay surprisingly missed out to Paraguay. Both nations bounced back to qualify in 1962, but both also finished third and were sent packing in the group stages. 1962. Sweden. In again for a second appearance, having reached the final of the 1958 World Cup, Sweden came crashing back down to earth again in 1962. By today's criteria, Sweden would have qualified for the World Cup, having finished level on points with Switzerland in their qualifying group, but with a far superior goal difference. That wasn't the case at the time, and in a one-off playoff game in Berlin, Switzerland won 2-1. By this stage, Sweden's famous trio of Gren and Lee were gone, but they still had a strong squad, and they probably would have offered more in Chile than Switzerland, who lost all 3 of their group games. 1966. Czechoslovakia. Just like Sweden, Czechoslovakia went from finalists to no-shows in the space of 4 short years. At the 1962 World Cup, only the brilliance of Brazil could deny Czechoslovakia of lifting the Jules Rimet trophy, but by 1966, the qualification process was starting to stiffen up. Czechoslovakia's qualifying group contained Portugal, Romania, and Turkey, all of whom were competitive, and with Eusebio, Portugal had rapidly become one of the best national teams on earth. Eusebio would prove to be the difference, as Portugal qualified and Czechoslovakia missed out. Portugal finished third at the finals in '66, with Eusebio winning the Golden Boot, but there were many teams at that World Cup who weren't a patch on Czechoslovakia. 1970. Argentina. Argentina's early World Cup history was a real mixed bag, but by the 1970s, they seemed to have become an established force. In 1966, Argentina reached the knockout stages, and they had a right to feel aggrieved by the nature of their departure against the host nation England. A 1970 qualification group containing only Peru and Bolivia ought to have been meat and drink for La Albiceleste. Despite paying a referee to fix the Bolivia vs Peru game in favour of Bolivia, Argentina still failed to qualify, winning only 1 of their 4 games. The 1970 World Cup is the only World Cup that Argentina have entered and failed to qualify for, but they would win the World Cup before the decade was done. 1974. Belgium. This was undoubtedly the tightest call in this entire video between Belgium, Portugal, and England. I think formidable cases could be made for all 3, but whilst England undoubtedly had the best squad on paper, I think Belgium in 1974 were probably the better team. Belgium had qualified for the European Championships for the first time in 1972, where they beat Hungary but lost to West Germany to finish third. Belgium didn't lose a single one of their 6 games in 1974 World Cup qualifying, winning 4 and drawing 2. Neighbouring Netherlands, boasting the likes of Johan Cruyff, Ruud Krul and Johan Neeskens, had an identical record, but qualified by virtue of their superior goal difference. The Dutch went on to reach the final of the 1974 World Cup, where they were beaten by West Germany. 1978. England. Having harshly overlooked England in 1974, they are the obvious choice in 1978. This was the England team of Keegan, Channon and Brooking, but despite their eclectic talents, the Three Lions failed to qualify for a second consecutive World Cup. Once again, it was an unfortunate qualifying campaign that saw England miss out, much tougher than the current format. England were tied in their group with Italy in terms of wins, draws and defeats, but a narrowly superior goal difference proved to be telling for the Azzurri. Italy ended up reaching the semi-finals of the 1978 World Cup, meanwhile England returned with a decent showing at the finals in 1982. 1982. Sweden. Poor old Sweden have had a handful of handy squads that haven't quite managed to qualify for the World Cup finals. To be honest, there weren't really any outstanding sides who failed to qualify for the 1982 World Cup, but Sweden did have a handful of decent players. By 1982, the UEFA qualification process had expanded further, with all but one group containing 5 teams and the top 2 teams progressing. Sweden finished above Portugal, but they were pipped to progression by Scotland and Northern Ireland. 1986. The Netherlands. The 1970s had very much been the decade of the Dutch national team, despite their failure to win 2 finals in 1974 and 1978. The Dutch fell off a cliff in the 1980s though, failing to qualify in both 1982 and 1986. For a squad that boasted the likes of Ruud Gullit, Ronald Koeman, Frank Rijkaard and Marco van Basten not to qualify for a World Cup is quite something, and just 2 years later, the Dutch proved their class by winning Euro '88. In 1986, the Netherlands finished second in their group and lost their qualifying playoff game to neighbouring Belgium on away goals. 1990. France. Another pretty stunning failure, having reached the semi-finals of the last 2 World Cups, France somehow failed to even qualify for Italia '90. The loss of midfield marvels Michel Platini and Jean Seguina were felt hard, although France should still have had enough talent to qualify. They finished third in their qualifying group behind Yugoslavia and Scotland, but they would bounce back and win the World Cup for the first time before the decade was out. 1994. England. I could very easily select France again in 1994, but I would edge towards England as having been slightly stronger than our near neighbours in the first half of the 1990s. France failed to qualify, finishing behind Sweden and Bulgaria. Meanwhile, England were bested by Norway and the Netherlands. To date, it is the most recent World Cups that both nations have failed to qualify for. The England team at that time could boast the likes of Tony Adams, Paul Ince and David Seaman, and they proved they were a decent outfit 2 years later at Euro 96. 1998. Portugal. Portugal really came to the fore as a national team during the 1960s before dropping off the face of the earth once again, and they've tended to have fits and starts ever since. By the late 1990s, they had their second golden generation, and one of the best players on earth in the form of Luis Figo. Even with the likes of Figo, Rui Costa and Fernando Couto, Portugal just missed out in qualifying to Germany and Ukraine. Portugal have since qualified for every single World Cup, and their golden generation would experience some joy at Euro 2000 and Euro 2004, although the nation didn't win their first piece of silverware until 2016. 2002. The Netherlands. The 2002 Netherlands team may actually be the greatest team to have failed to qualify for a major tournament ever. During that qualifying campaign, the Netherlands had the likes of Philip Cocu, Patrick Kluivert, Jaap Stam, Edwin van der Sar, Mark Overmars, Mark van Bommel, Ruud van Nistelrooy, Frank de Boer, Edgar Davids, Clarence Seedorf, and even a young Rafael van der Vaart at their disposal. It was virtually footballing royalty from 1 to 11, and had they qualified, the Dutch would have been among the favourites in Japan and South Korea. Remarkably, the Netherlands only won 6 of their 10 qualifiers, finishing behind Portugal and the Republic of Ireland, prompting manager Louis van Gaal to resign. 2006. Turkey. You may be surprised to find out that Turkey have only ever played in 2 World Cups, unless of course you are Turkish, in which case you almost certainly already knew that and didn't need reminding of that fact. Despite not being World Cup regulars, Turkey took bronze at the 2002 World Cup, with Brazil the only team to beat them. In 2006 qualifying, Turkey finished second in their group to put them in playoff contention, where they were beaten by virtue of only away goals in a 2-leg classic against Switzerland. Almost 2 decades on, Turkey still haven't qualified for a World Cup since 2002. 2010. Croatia. The seeds of a very good Croatian team had already been sown back in 2010, with a qualifying squad that boasted the likes of Niko Kranjčar, Luka Modric, Ivica Olic, Mario Mandzukic and Eduardo. Croatia had qualified for every World Cup since becoming independent from Yugoslavia and becoming FIFA members prior to 2010, but that run would come to an end at the hands of England and Ukraine, who finished as the winners and runners-up in their qualifying group. Croatia have qualified for every World Cup and Euro since, and even reached the World Cup final in 2018. 2014. Sweden. With a remarkable 4 inclusions, no nation features as frequently in this video as Sweden. Sweden have qualified for the World Cup 12 times, which is more than the likes of Russia and the Netherlands, but they've also just missed out a fair few times as well. In 2014 qualifying, Sweden were always up against it with Germany in their qualifying group, but they finished second ahead of both Austria and the Republic of Ireland to put them in the playoffs. Sweden's playoff game pitted Zlatan Ibrahimovic up against Cristiano Ronaldo, and from 2 inspired talismanic performances, it was Ronaldo and Portugal who came out on top. 2018. The Netherlands. The most recent World Cup is one of the toughest shouts of all, with Chile, the Netherlands and Italy all failing to qualify. Cases could be made in favour of all 3, but on the balance of things, I think the Netherlands probably have the strongest squad. With a mixture of youth and experience, the Dutch could call upon the likes of Matthijs de Ligt, Virgil van Dijk and Jorginho Wijnaldum, in addition to older heads like Daley Blind, Ryan Babel and Ian Robben. The Netherlands finished 3rd in their qualifying group, behind France and Sweden, although they only missed out to Sweden on goal difference. It was the second tournament the Orange missed, having also been absent from Euro 2016, but they have recovered in the 2 years since. That's it for today's video. Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Since you've got this far and in exchange for eternal good luck and happiness, why not subscribe and turn on notifications for the ever brilliant HITC Sevens. Also, for mobile users, if you click on your screen now there should be some suggestions of other videos YouTube thinks you might like, and I agree with YouTube. If you're watching on desktop, they should appear of their own accord. Thank you all for watching, give us a like if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a brilliant day.